Well, on that happy note, I'm not sure where we can go. Our set of four panelists, I think, gave us a rather bleak view, I think, in terms of the future of urbanism, about the possibilities of looking at a future that certainly doesn't match with what we might hope. I picked out a few themes, I think, that came across in all the papers. One was, I think that what's quite clear is that there are rival claims for urban space. Groups, individuals, all make a forceful claim for a place for themselves in the city, and that this creates a kind of anxious urbanism that sort of underscores the relationships then that emerge. And I think one of the other themes that emerges is this theme about the fantasies of control. Ben talked at one point about how these claims to the city give rise to a kind of fear-induced calls for new modes of governance at key nodal points. Bryan talked about a kind of securitocracy in zones of extreme exception that sort of invade urban space. And Joy gave us, I think, some disturbing images of ways of displaying the apocalypse. And Valerie reminds us of how barricades become a kind of naturalized element in urban space. So what I'd like to ask all of them to comment on is the extent to which they see this as a sort of a general theme, a general tendency, a sort of current that leads us into the future, or might there be countervailing images, pressures that would give us, I think, some hope for building a more just and equitable city without the need for the kind of security fantasies.
Well, I guess the title of my talk was Ambivalence and or Utopia, and I guess for me, it has to be both. I think the optimism and the projection of just cities has to be, in essence, built through and even upon the constraint of security fantasies. I don't think that they can be undone. I think that they are integral to what cities are and what they've been, and I think maybe what's changed is the intensification of them, but and the granularity and decentralization by which they move. But I think we have to see it as a constrained condition against which these things move. I think our last presentation did this as well. Showed this well. For me, I don't know. I'm not particularly optimistic about where everything is going. I would like to be, but I think that we have to look at it a different way. While you were talking, I was thinking of a quote from Bruce Sterling, who said that the ruins of the unsustainable will be the frontiers of tomorrow. And in a way, I think we have to look at the integral catastrophe that is unfolding around us as a beginning point and as something out of which whatever comes next will be constructed. And I hope in a way that it will be done in a way that's not reliant upon countervailing fantasies or utopias of a kind of final resolution or justice, but is more tactical, more parametric, more bottom-up. And I think the challenge then for urbanism is this. I mean, in a way, I think we may look back at a conference like this in a few years and look at the idea that urbanism and cities themselves could somehow be designed and conceptualized separate from all of the other socio-technical layers that operate within cities as a kind of perverse anachronism. And I think in a way where urbanism is moving and has moved and continues to be is just something that is able to conceptualize the interrelationships or interface points between these different forms of institutionality, these different forms of social technical systems at once. In other words, urbanism becomes a subset of interface design, where if we think of interfaces as any point of contact between complex systems that govern the conditions of exchange between those systems, in cities, that means physical hardware, it means physical software, it means fiber that's built into the ground, it means devices that we hold in our hands that we move around with and are able to reprogram spaces on the fly. But how all of this operates together as a kind of integral mechanism that is both falling apart and coming together at the same time, perhaps falling apart faster than it's coming together in other sorts of ways, I think has to be the basis of agenda going forward.
Oh, I mean, I agree with a lot of that, definitely. I think the condition is just so endemic from the beginning. That, like when I said military urbanism, I think is the condition of globalization. I think it's the condition of civilization on some level. I mean, there's such a intrinsic problematic there to kind of undo, and so how do we begin to kind of turn all that on itself? I can't say I have any idea, but I think it starts, just like the fallacy that we think we can completely control the landscape through some sort of design, through security design. I mean, I think that's how the securitocracy, if you will, operates, is that they think that they can completely dictate the politics and levels of control by converting and harnessing and weaponizing the landscape. But on the other side of that is I don't think that we can do the reverse, which would be to design justice and rely solely on a designed landscape as well. I mean, urbanism, landscape, space can only do so much. And so I think, ultimately where I come from, my gut is that, people need to get active. They can't rely on things to be done for them. They can't rely on some kind of urban justice, spatial design that's going to erase this for them. It's going to bring equality, equity. I mean, people need to get out there and they need to reclaim their own space. I mean, they need to reclaim their own perspective, their own awareness. I mean, secrecy exists, I think, largely in politics of corruption and all this stuff because people just don't look. People don't want to deal. And that surrendering just further empowers, and that defeatedness is what lends more power. So I think it starts right there in the person's own living room, and just taking responsibility for their own space, their own action, and then trying to expand outward, starting with the local. I mean, comment was made last panel was that now's a good time to buy real estate. Now's a good time to become a developer, and maybe that's true to some extent. But my fear was that maybe that just reverses, that just basically exchanges one entity of power to another through space. We need to re-energize the public domain, not necessarily a transfer of private power from one receptacle to another, but we need to figure out how to get people involved. So if there is going to be a crisis, there is happening. I'm all for, in some sadistic way, but in a hopeful way, getting it over with, getting to it, getting it on, and get the rebuilding going. Where at least we're in a position where maybe we can negotiate in some level, because people are so fed up. People have been so disenfranchised. Now they're actually willing to get out and do something. So, on that level, I think the collapse is the new frontier, but it's not going to come necessarily through urban design or urbanism itself as a planned, formal thing. I'm kind of rambling as usual.
I don't know. I mean, it seems to be always about autonomy versus control in some form or other. And ironically, and maybe completely not what you expected based on my, I guess, rather dark presentation, I am actually maybe just a schizoid, but I feel very optimistic about certain things in terms of a kind of participatory social networking, kind of culture that has arisen. I mean, most of us here have grown up through both the television culture, couch potato culture, and now a much more autonomous culture of the internet and Twitter and this and that and the other. And I think that, I mean, part of what I find really exciting is that not just a specialist painter such as myself who is looking for certain kinds of, say, imagery in my case, but that just any amateur can really take part and parse the media narrative or whatever else needs parsing and create and put it out there instantaneously with very little money required. And I see the darkness. I don't see that going away, but I feel personally empowered by my own journey from the television couch potato passive person who is also learning to, to be an autonomous creator, not at the beck and call of a company or a publishing house or a music label, but just on my own. But I see that has changed completely, and the author is, everybody's an author, and there's a great deal of potential there. And of course there are blockades, there are obstacles, there's the obscene, extreme property ethic that has created a rather perverse copyright environment at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that since we're all able to somehow engage in ways that we never could before, we meaning just people, folks, non-professionals, that this is there's like just an enormous amount of potential there. So I suppose then the answer to how to tap it has really to do with education on every level.
Yeah, that's a good catch that I can get, since I'm raising 3 kids, and basically I'm learning a lot from them, and I would like to displace the idea of control with the idea of risk. For me, what is problematic is that we are living in a system where we are taking less and less risk. So as a mom, I need to tell my kids every day, go on, take some risk it. To risk anything in the city, basically, most of the time we have to break the rules. We have to run where they are not supposed to run. We have to jump when they are not supposed to jump. We have to ride their bicycle where it's, again, forbidden. And taking those risks and breaking the rules, then my education basically is to help them to negotiate and to prove that they are right to do it, that they cannot lose so young their animality. They cannot be blind to their environment, and they have to learn from themselves how far they can go in taking those risks. We cannot impose barricades in that case, everywhere, and I can see hope a lot. This extends from the urban space to internet. As you know, in China, there's a huge barricade. I mean, there's already in the rest of the world with Web 2, but Google is even forbidden, and having this conflict using this other space, which is also where we spend most of our time. And then there are tons of proxy available to jump on the barricade. So I think it's always a cat and mouse situation when things are done, and maybe this whole system is being active and fascinating for this reason.
See, I think this whole issue of anxious urbanism plays itself out in kind of new efforts to rebuild cities, a kind of re-urbanism. I mean, I work on cities in Africa, and there's a company now this is the consequence of the end of apartheid now, is that companies in South Africa can explore the rest of the continent for whatever they'd like to do. And there's one company that now has bought up land around about 5 or 6 cities, major cities in the rest of Africa, and what they want to do is re-urbanize. They want to take a city like Lagos and, in effect, rebuild it. And their fantasy, the real estate developer's fantasy, is to rebuild the city completely securitized, completely separated from the old city. So there's a kind of sister cities or city doubles. And that's their fantasy to connect to the world economy. Now, I'm not so sure, I don't know how general you can see that pattern, and I'd like maybe your comments to talk a little bit about, again, to go back to that point about whether or not this sort of theme of security is a common theme, and again, whether or not we can see alternatives to that emerge in embryonic form in other places.
I think it is a theme. I think it's becoming, if not already, an integral technique of geopolitics at all these scales. I think what's striking about these presentations is the polyscalar logic of this, from within a particular building or even a gallery space, all the way up to the scale of a city, to the differentiation of countries in North America. That it in fact works in this sort of way. I think it's an unsustainable strategy. If this is sort of a question, to me, it goes back to the Derrida's comment on the post 9/11 situation, where it appears as though cities suffer from a kind of autoimmune disorder by which they, in fear of some external attack, they attack themselves. That buildings essentially enact violence upon their own surfaces and cities upon their own structures as a way to prevent this. So, I mean, clearly I think that the greater violence done to the urban body is by counter-terrorist techniques than by terrorist techniques. But perhaps more troublesome, and I think all of these panelists who get to this, is the conflation between these kinds of events of exceptional violence, 9/11 and Mumbai and things like this, and the kind of petty, everyday, general disorder, shoplifters, and where people should sit and how long they should sit there, and essentially where the grandiose and the petty become conflated into a single kind of sort of conception. I think is a dangerous and unsustainable generalization of the exception as a form.
See, and I think that Valerie suggests, the sort of in-between spaces, the interstices, where performance can, in a sense, make fun of, and can undermine the sort of logic of security by treating it as something other than what it was intended to be.
I agree. And I think it's wonderful. Virilio has this point. So obviously, Virilio comes up again in this, that the invention of any new technology is also simultaneously the invention of a new accident, right? But I think it also works the other way around. That the invention that any new accident is also the invention of a new kind of technology. And I think part of what you're working with works with this. I think there's also, however, a limit to framing this issue entirely in terms of kind of resistance versus control, and to sort of repeat the 68 sort of moment again and again within this as well. The trick then, of course, is then how do these tactical events of resistance or play, in essence, have the capacity to enforce themselves as a countervailing governance over this space, where they in fact are able to take on the position of the hegemon within that space. And I think that's a much more difficult procedure. And it goes, I think, to what Teddy was saying about the designing of the political and the invention of the political. I think that's the task in this sort of way, is to reconceptualize this. And in that sense, urbanism for me is a function of this. But I'll turn it over.
I just wanted to say, and I'm not here to criticize your work by any means, because I think it's great, but on some level, I get worried that in the kind of reclamation of these topical, superficial sort of urban barriers, and there are noble uses and ways of reclaiming them to some degree, but they also keep it just topical. I mean, how do they really get at the larger hegemon? Do they really get at, kind of or deconstructing the power regime of the larger institutional problem? I'm not sure they do. So in some ways, I think a lot of these barriers are put out as these kind of, obviously the sort of security theater. I mean, what do these barriers really even do? But then when they become sort of these play devices for the public, it just kind of normalizes the situation. It kind of pacifies the resistance to them in a way, because my attitude is go rip those barriers down, and if you go to jail in the process, then hopefully you start a larger process of radical upheaval, and I'm a proponent of that. But so, I get fearful that we thinking that we're engaging these kinds of things, and but really we're only falling into another form of a trap. That we're just sort of meeting them on their terms, and how to undo all this stuff is the trillion-dollar question. I think can spatial practice play a form in this? I think so. I mean, I forgot the architect's name in Spain who kind of games the system. He finds these kind of loopholes in urban policy, and then he'll do projects that sort of get around them, that playing in that space, that zone of is it legal, is it not legal, but it's sort of filling a need, and it's, I like the idea of a sort of subversive architect, an illegal architect that can go in there and call into question, but then also operate in that zone, much like Teddy and plenty of others are talking about. But again, I think that can only do so much. When it comes to what I was talking about, the real institution of secrecy, how do you attack that? I mean, these people need to be held accountable, and I think in some level, we need to depart from the institution as much as we need to try to break it down. People need to get political. The political is not going to be reinvented for them. I think people are sitting around waiting. They're waiting for things to be done. And people need to go out there, and they need to create their own structure in their own community. They need to create their own community. They really, really need to find community, what that means again. And I think that's been lost. I think maybe this is part of a neoliberal psychosis that we're all just living a splintered private life, our own secret lives, if you will. And in that sense, we're just participating in the secrecy as well. We've withdrawn to our own sphere of secrecy, and that just creates a new barrier that protects the larger institution of secrecy at work. So I think people need to get public. I don't know.
I mean, I guess what you're saying is we're all complicit in some way, but I have to respectfully disagree about the barriers, because when you tear them down, you're still treating them as barriers. But when you take possession of them as an artist, speaking as an artist, when you take possession of something and change it into something else, it doesn't function in opposition to what it was. It functions as something new. And I see that really is a détournement. That really is a perfect metaphor for what needs to be done elsewhere, because that oppositional thing that was very popular once and has shown us it doesn't work. It's a kind of way to keep the polarity going, to keep the argument going, instead of getting outside it and finding another way. I mean, I think that business of, I think that's the challenge, because we are complicit, we see our complicity, we're in denial of it. There's a deep desire to tear the barriers down. I feel that all the time. And yet through a kind of process that's research and creative, that draws from research and that is creative, eventually those processes have to be staged somewhere. And whether it's in an art gallery, in a university setting, in a city street, you're within the system. You're within the system. A street artist is within the system. Graffiti artist, there's a tradition. You're subverting certain things, but you're doing it within a norm. You're doing it within a tradition. So there are ways. It's very hard to see anything really happening that isn't coming from the inside organically, in some way, organically. Dumb word. But what I mean is through a process that possesses on some level and transforms. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not in a society where things get removed, and I think it's on opposite. It's a society where we accumulate, and with miniaturization, something that you're familiar with, you accumulate, and you even accumulate within the invisible. So I don't think by removing you're solving anything. I think by, I mean, you remove a wall and a bigger one is growing elsewhere. But by transforming, by detoning, when a barrier is not called anymore a barrier, if it becomes a toy, then you're changing the system, you're changing the landscape, and you're inviting people, I mean, to get out, and the kids mainly, to get out of Facebook and the computer back to the city. And I think parkour in this case, and we can see how successful is it in just around the world as something free. I mean, their body as the last tool they can use. I mean, they cannot skate, but yet they can run. They cannot be forbidden to run, to jump, and to play with the landscape. So I think it's rebuilding this kind of community which was lost, and they are becoming less passive in this case. I think it's a very good education for them to learn. I mean, they are growing in an environment which is maybe less scary for them. We saw massive transformation, but they are born within this space. I mean, my kids are in their 10th years. So, I mean, they are born with internet, they are born with a city which is completely commodified, which is already completely global, where they travel a lot from Tokyo to US, and they see the same thing, the same shops. So for them, I think it's a very good way to be less passive and to find ways of infiltrating the system.
I mean, I agree 100%. I think that, but sometimes I wonder that the sort of superficial reclamation of the barrier is a fantasy of reclamation. You know, that, yeah, you take the wall down, there's another wall elsewhere, or you paint the wall and there's your wall that's still there and the wall that's elsewhere. Yeah, you've turned it into something, you've given it a new use. Have you subverted it? The wall is still there. It's still serving its purpose. You know, for example, I think there's a proposal. There's an architect in Berkeley who's proposed the U.S.-Mexican border fence is becoming a new kind of social ecological infrastructure. You know, from green, solar paneling to different kind of walk through sort of shared spaces, and those kind of things, as noble and intended as they are, to me again they just they normalize the violence. They in some ways at that point they've decided that they're going to accept the violence, and then they're just going to do their best they can to live with it, and then it becomes a means of selling the violence in some ways. We'll put out this barrier, and then we'll know that in the park it will be appropriated minimally by skaters and whatever, but that's it. That's as far as the resistance goes. And so, I just, I mean, again, I'm not here to criticize your work. I like the work, and I'm all for it, but again, I think that, yeah, there is a deeper strategy that has to happen, and I don't know what that is. I mean, again, I think people need to get out in the streets. They need to start participating in their system. They need to start wake up, not waiting for things to be done for them. I mean, it's not an urban question. It's a personal participation in the production of your own space question. People need to get active in the production of their own space.
Totally agree.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a general statement, but I think your projects do invite that.
I think that the reversibility of these is actually central to what they are, what they do. While you were talking, I was thinking of, there was a photo that during the Yugoslavian war, there was a photo that was published, I think in the Daily Mail, that showed some Bosnian prisoners behind a fence, and they were sort of standing behind the fence, emaciated. And this photo immediately went around the world. It sort of shocked the conscience of Europe in particular, that the concentration camps were existing in Europe once again, and immediately turned attention to the war that had previously been sort of forgotten as a people with unpronounceable names doing unspeakable things for unfathomable reasons kind of situation. Now, the Serbians sued the Daily Mail for defamation over this photo because they claimed that, in fact, it was misrepresented, that it wasn't that the prisoners were behind this fence being held in. It was, in fact, that the photographer was behind the fence, and the prisoners had come up to the fence and were looking in on him. And it's this reversibility of the camp and the bunker, which are architecturally, formally the same, that I think is the key insight into how these interfaces actually operate. On that point.
I think there's multiple stories told about militarization and securitization of urban space, but there's also other stories that need to be told too. And it's not just, it seems to me it's not just the acts of resistance, but it's more like the sort of banality of it all, the sort of what ordinary people do when they sort of commandeer spaces that were never intended to be used in the ways that they do. And I think that squatters taking over buildings and rebuilding them, people establishing relationships of mutual aid, and I think those stories need to be built against these other stories, not necessarily to give a balance, but at least to provide some sense that there's not one overriding narrative that sort of trumps everything else. So on that note, I think we've run out of time, and I want to thank everyone, and we'll see you all tomorrow.